where is Kate Bishop?
I've never met her. I have no idea.
Bro! Marvel's Hawkeye shows us how the regularest Avenger is getting on after helping Earth's mightiest heroes save the world a few times, and introduces us to Kate Bishop, his successor to the Hawkeye mantle in the comics. Directed by Rhys Thomas, the premiere of Disney Plus's next live-action MCU adventure forces Clint Barton to deal with his dark past while being bombarded by holiday cheer, among other things. We'll dig into that, plus where we think the series is headed based on what we know from the comics, but before we get into all that, I have to warn you we are about to spoil everything about the first 2 episodes of the Hawkeye series and what we think is coming up, so if you haven't watched it yet or you don't want to know what might happen next, now would be the perfect time to make some very loud noises to drown us out. Hey, there was an Easter egg in that tower. Hang out with us to the end of this video and we will talk about it, but in the meantime, now that we're past the spoiler warning, let's get to the good stuff. Clint is in New York City for Christmas on a trip with his kids when somebody uses his old Ronin suit to stop a violent stick-up by some tracksuit gangster bros at a black market auction. That somebody is Kate Bishop, a young woman now in her 20s from a wealthy New York family who just so happens to be totally combat trained. We'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Kate's Ronin cosplay makes the evening news, and Clint realizes he should probably get involved before some very dangerous people hunt down this new Ronin and make her pay for all the stuff that Clint did back when he was the old Ronin. Meanwhile, somebody killed this rich old dude named Armand Duquesne, and his nephew Jack, who's about to become Kate's stepdad, escapes the auction with Ronin's cool retractable sword. He's not just a total kleptomaniac, he's a sword collector who steals stuff. So right away, this series is dealing with Clint's bloody time as Ronin. Clint had no qualms during that 5-year span between the snap and the blip, brutally murdering bad guys, but he was understandably in a pretty dark place after his family was turned to dust. We'll get into the Ronin specific stuff in a minute, but first, a quick recap.
Told you.
Meet the new Hawkeye. Kate Bishop hasn't been given the official title just yet, but we all know where this is headed thanks to the comics. The show opens during the Chitauri invasion in the Battle of New York from the first Avengers movie, and I guess also Avengers Endgame if you want to be technical about it. But anyway, Kate's fancy apartment home is one of many, many buildings suffering some pretty major property damage in this catastrophic event, but this just gives Kate a front row seat to watch Hawkeye fighting some alien invaders, and then he even eventually saves her life during the battle. This understandably inspires Kate to become an archer and a trained martial artist on her own, so when the tracksuit bros attack the black market auction, she knows enough to stay alive in a gunfight and help stop the attack. Clint Barton, who's just trying to enjoy a nice holiday trip to New York with his kiddos, gets involved after seeing Kate on TV and wants to shut the whole thing down as quickly as possible and get back to his family, but things don't really work out that way. The fancy black market auction was randomly happening at a party that Kate's rich mom was throwing, and Kate, being Kate, totally snuck in disguised as part of the waitstaff. They're auctioning off Ronin's suit and his retractable sword that he killed like 20 guys with. Actually, no, probably way more. Definitely way more. He was killing dudes for like 5 years. Anyway, enter the Tracksuit Mafia. More on them later, bro. But they attack, Kate pops on the suit and into action, foiling the Mafia guys as they try to rob the auction. She holds her own as she fights her way out, only to be cornered by the Mafia, and look, they are not happy, bro. Clint shows up and he gets her out of there. The premiere ends with Clint and Kate together hiding out from the Tracksuit Mafia, and then at the end of episode 2 we find out that these guys are actually working for Maya Lopez, the MCU's version of Echo, who was the first Ronin from the comics, but we don't know what she's after quite yet. Okay, so back to that other Ronin. Remember when Clint totally killed a bunch of people as Ronin before the Avengers assembled to fix everything Thanos did in Endgame? Yeah, well, the rest of the world hasn't forgotten Ronin either, and it's his dark legacy that kind of drives this whole story. Nobody knows who Ronin was except Clint, obviously, but the actions of Ronin seem to be pretty well known, if not to the general public, then definitely to the criminal underworld. And here's the thing. Kate's family brushes up pretty closely to the criminal underworld, which is how she wound up at a frickin' black market auction in the first place. Jack Duquesne and his rich uncle Armand are at the auction. Remember, Jack is about to marry Kate's mom, and it's pretty clear early on that this guy is probably a bad guy. Now, Jack's character seems to be inspired by the comics, and we'll get into that when we do Easter eggs in a minute, but the important thing here is that he makes off with Ronin's retractable sword from the auction after bidding against his own uncle for it during the auction, with money that it's pretty clear he doesn't even have. If you're looking for a clear villain in Hawkeye, Jack Duquesne is definitely at the top of the possibles list. Anyway, if you know how they show a gun in the first act that has to pop up again near the end of the story, well in this case, the gun is a sword. So whatever Jack has planned for it will eventually mean that Kate will have to fight him for it at the end of this. Speaking of Kate, she snagged Ronin's suit before committing the genius move of fighting with a whole bunch of violent gangsters in an immediately recognizable costume and then totally getting caught on camera afterward. Kate didn't seem to know who this costume belonged to, she just grabbed it in the heat of the moment during the Tracksuit mafia attack. It seems like she grabbed the suit to protect herself and her identity, but it wound up just making her a massive target for some very dangerous people. And that's what's driving Clint here. His deadly legacy as Ronin is pretty messy, so much so that it just dragged in a young girl who didn't have anything to do with any of it in the first place, but now he feels compelled to protect her as dangerous people who know the Ronin's legacy are looking for a little payback, and it's kinda his fault. Clint and Kate have to abandon the suit in episode 2 when the Tracksuit Mafia shows up to perforate Kate's safe house and generally just set it on fire. When Clint goes back for it, it's gone, so he knows he has to go hunt it down. The hunt for the Ronin suit, of course, leads Clint to a LARP in episode 2, where a guy just wore the Ronin suit for clout. Clint very much wants to grab the suit and go, but he gets sucked into the magical world of live-action roleplay and actually looks like he has a little bit of fun, too. He eventually wins the suit back via trial by combat, but then he gets kidnapped by the Tracksuit Mafia at the end of the episode, and Kate, being Kate, also gets captured as she tries to rescue him. And that's when the main Tracksuit Bro reports the character we know is Maya Lopez, aka Echo, aka Ronin. In the comics, Maya Lopez is Kingpin's adopted daughter and the first character to carry the Ronin mantle, and she's portrayed here by Alaqua Cox. Maya Lopez is a hearing-impaired athlete and martial artist who's capable of mimicking the movements of her opponents, which is why she goes by Echo when she's not being Ronin, because an echo is like a noise that copies you, right? Anyway, the Tracksuit Mafia seems to be working for her in this series, which is definitely not the case in the comics, but perhaps she also has a history with the Ronin mantle in the show, like she does in the Marvel Comics. We never really got much context in Endgame for why specifically Clint decided to dress up like a ninja, swap his bow for a sword, and then get a Macklemore haircut, but I guess grief works in mysterious ways.
Don't give me hope.
Clint has been through a lot by this point, and he seems to be dealing with some PTSD symptoms as he watches the delightful Rogers the Musical. He also gets sent pretty deep into his feelings about Natasha Romanoff while watching the performance of this Broadway production's Black Widow. Keep in mind the last time that Clint saw Natasha was while they were on their mission to Vormir, and she was well on her way to becoming yet another stain that nobody is around to even clean up. What, you think the Red Skull's gonna go down there and mop it up? You know he's not, they don't pay him for that. But I digress. Natasha represents the most personal loss that Clint suffered at the hands of Thanos, what with his whole family getting Control-Z'd back into existence by Bruce Banner's snap in Endgame. But just like the original timeline's Gamora, who Thanos cruelly sacrificed for the Soul Stone, Natasha, possibly Clint's closest friend in the world, is also perma-dead and not coming back, and it seems like Clint is very much wrestling with that as he enters this new adventure with Kate Bishop. As the series progresses, we expect we'll see Clint's relationship with Natasha fueling the way he deals with the young hero Kate Bishop, but we can also bet that his history with the Black Widow won't end there. One of the MCU's ongoing subplots is this lady going around to recruit new remarkable individuals for her own purposes. She's already got a killer Captain America on her payroll, and that's not all. Last we saw, she was giving Natasha's adopted sister Yelena Belova, aka the new Black Widow, her latest target, who just so happens to be Clint Barton. There's no sign of Yelena in the premiere, but Florence Pugh, the actress who plays Yelena, has been confirmed to appear in the Hawkeye series, so she's probably going to show up and try to kill Clint at the worst possible time. I mean, there's no convenient time to get assassinated, but during the holidays in New York, when you're supposed to be watching the kids, that's just inconsiderate scheduling. Anyway, when Yelena shows up, you can bet that Clint is going to be forced to reckon with Natasha's death in a pretty profound way. Okay, so this is clearly a Christmas show, but it still has Easter eggs, and we're gonna run down some of the ones that we found. Here's what we got, bro. The show opens on the Battle of New York from the very first Avengers film, just it's from Kate's perspective as the Chitauri invasion force rips Manhattan to shreds and Hawkeye is out there shooting arrows at aliens, inspiring the young Kate. By the way, in the comics, it's Kate's mom's death who starts her on her path to being a hero, and in the show, it was her dear old dad. Clint was all of us during the performance of Rogers the Musical, pointing out that Ant-Man wasn't even at the Battle of New York. Of course, Scott Lang, aka Ant-Man, didn't become a respected member of the team until Avengers Endgame, and look, even then, the word respected is probably a bit of a stretch. Thanos was right, or at least that's what this particular vandal thought before scrawling it at the theater. A subtle reminder that Thanos disappearing half of all the life in the universe absolutely happened, and the MCU's Earthlings are still very much dealing with that. This is also vaguely reminiscent of the sentiment Magneto was right, which pops up repeatedly in X-Men comics. Speaking of dead MCU villains, the MCU's public probably doesn't know about Obadiah Stane's Ironmonger situation if they're allowing clock towers. Oh, well, I guess it doesn't matter now. That's right, that clock tower was dedicated to Obadiah in 2006, 3 years before the Ironmonger fiasco and the partnership with the 10 Rings that preceded it. I guess the public must have actually bought the line that this was just a training exercise. Okay, enough about old villains, here's something about a new one, or maybe not, we'll see. Kate's mom's fiance, Jack Duquesne, is inspired by Jacques Duquesne from the comics, also known as the Swordsman. The comics version was more of an anti-hero than a villain, actually responsible for training a young Clint Barton to fight, so we'll see if Jack turns to the dark side or not. His uncle, Armand Duquesne, is the guy who winds up dead at the end of the show premiere, and he's also from the comics where he was the swordsman's father and not his uncle, and we might not yet know who killed him in the show. In the comics, it was the servants because he treated them like garbage and they hated him, which is probably a lot more straightforward than what we're dealing with here. Kate has an aunt named Moira Brandon. In the comics, Moira Brandon was a retired movie star and honorary Avenger whose mansion eventually became the new Avengers compound. Bro, lots of elements from Marvel's now iconic Hawkeye comics series from Matt Fraction and David Aja make it into this series, bro. The Tracksuit Mafia breaks up the black market auction at the end of the episode, and they're also inspired by the Fraction Aja run. They're called the Tracksuit Draculas in the comics, which is a little odd. In the show, the bros seem to be working for Maya Lopez, aka Echo, but as we mentioned earlier, that's not the case originally. Pizza Dog! In the show, Kate saves the doggo from oncoming traffic and makes a fast friend by offering him the chef's kiss delicacy that is cold pizza. Lucky the Pizza Dog belonged to the Tracksuit Mafia in the comics before Clint and Kate take him in, but in this case, he's just apparently a stray. Clint's hearing aid is another detail from the comic where he wears a hearing aid because of childhood abuse, and though he rarely uses it, Clint also knows American Sign Language and even loses his hearing completely when the assassin Clown stabs him in the ear hole with one of his own arrows. Ugh. Kate is yet another key member of the Young Avengers from the comics, and the MCU has been steadily introducing the rest of the roster in other projects. Wiccan and Speed appeared in WandaVision, and last we saw, Wanda was searching the multiverse for them. Cassie Lang, aka Stature from the comics, has appeared in the Ant-Man films, and most recently, a post-snap Cassie appeared in Avengers Endgame. Eli Bradley, aka Patriot, was there when Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes visited his uncle Isaiah in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and somewhere at the edge of time, Loki is still dodging Goliath in multiversal oblivion. By the way, more Young Avengers are still en route to the MCU. Miss Marvel and America Chavez are both due to appear in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness in 2023, not to mention the Miss Marvel Disney Plus series is also expected sometime next year. And we'll end on that watch from the Avengers compound. Why is this important, and does the number 268 happen to refer to Avengers number 268? Only time will tell. So what did you think of the first episode of Hawkeye? Did it hit the mark, or was it a little bit to the left? What do you think is going to happen next? And most importantly, would you go see an Avengers musical? No? What if it was officially part of the MCU? You'd do it then. Anyway, let's hear your theories in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Canon Fodder. For more Marvel, allow us to break down that crazy Eternals ending, and don't forget to follow and subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch.